everybody, and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I'm your host, Taylor Rockwell. Daryl is not with me. He is, I believe, over the Atlantic, flying back to the United States, or preparing to do so. So instead of Daryl, I've got Sports Illustrated's Grant Wahl. Grant Wahl is here to talk about the many different projects he's got going on. We talk about Throwback, his podcast about the 1991 World Cup, specifically the U.S. squad before, during, and after the 91 World Cup. But we talk a bit about his book, Masters of Modern Soccer. He has a chapter about Vincent Kompany, so we get into a little bit about Vincent Kompany, his move to Anderlecht. Will he be a good manager? What Grant Wahl makes of that decision. And lastly, their new series, Exploring Planet Futbol. It's a new video series by Sports Illustrated, in which, at least for the first episode, Grant goes around and talks to 4 different players, Chris Richards, Tyler Adams, Weston McKennie, and Christian Pulisic, about like their experiences playing in Germany, why they chose to play in Germany, and sort of the American experience of playing soccer in Germany. So it's some great interviews there, and I would say it's a great interview with Grant because he talks all about the projects. He gives us kind of some inside looks as to the interviews and the insight he got from them. And then, you know, what else he's going to be doing this summer. So it's a good long interview. In the middle, you are going to hear from Daryl Grove. We're answering one listener question in the middle of the show, this one about what player, like, do we wish had reached their peak or prime for the U.S. national team but failed to do so either because of injury or because they just kind of didn't meet expectations? We have different but sort of similar answers, so you can look forward to that too. But for now, I will just turn it over to myself talking to Grant Wahl. With me now, I've got Grant Wahl of Sports Illustrated fame, but many other projects. Grant, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. I know you're very busy.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm never too busy to talk to you.
Yeah, so first of all, I appreciate that. That's good to know. I'm going to call you at all hours now. But second, we wanted to have you on the show because, as I said, you've got a lot of stuff going on. You've got various projects. I want to kind of take them in order then, starting off with Throwback. Can you tell us a little bit about Throwback and what your plan is for this season?
Yeah, so it's Throwback is a new podcast series from Sports Illustrated where I'm doing the first season, which is on the first FIFA Women's World Cup in 1991, and also on the U.S. national team, the women's national team that started in 85 and then went on to win that World Cup in 91. And it's the first time I've ever hosted a podcast, like a storytelling podcast series, and I'm amazed by how different it is than sort of my weekly Planet Futbol podcast where I interview somebody, which I also enjoy, but it's really a process of not just doing all the interviews that we did with former U.S. women's players and even Sepp Blatter for this podcast series, but then all the script writing, all the voiceover stuff, and it's been a really fun process. And this, you know, the subject matter has been a lot of fun to talk to people like Michelle Akers and Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy about the early days of the U.S. women's national team. And I'll be honest, I didn't know a lot of this stuff, you know, about what happened in the mid to late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, actually, I wanted let's go there then, because we on this show got a lot of questions about why the U.S. women's team is so much better than the men's team. We tend to give a couple different answers, one of which is usually that, like, the women were in a more advantageous position. They were kind of on the ground floor when the first World Cup came into existence. But based on what I've heard so far from the first 2 episodes, it sounds like that's really not quite fair, given where the team were, like, in terms of maybe in the mid 80s and where they were in the competitions there.
Well, that's been really interesting to me because even soccer people say, well, one reason that the U.S. women's team has been so good and winning World Cups from the start is they got a head start on the rest of the world. And that is simply not true.
Yeah.
You had, when the first, U.S. women's team came together in 1985 and they played in a tournament in Italy called the Mundialito, I think the quote from Michelle Akers was, "We got our asses kicked."
Yes, it was.
She's wonderful, by the way. And the way she put it was they were just really naive that they hadn't played internationally before, and a lot of the players spent their tournament sort of complaining to the referee about how that was a foul and not getting calls, and just, they played 4 games. They won none of them. They lost 3 of them. and they had a real sort of lesson in the international game. And to hear people like Akers and Anson Dorrance, who came in the following year as the U.S. women's coach, to hear them tell this story, they feel like, conventional wisdom says we were born on the mountaintop and we weren't, and we actually had to get there. And so that was really interesting to me.
And is that then like what the kind of rest of the season is going to be? Is it leading up to 91? Or are you going to go back to 1999? Because you kind of start with 99, you go back to 91, then you go further back into the 80s. I don't want to give away too much, but I'm curious if that's sort of where you're expecting it to go.
So, yeah, we literally today, as we're recording this, just recorded the final episode 5.
All right.
So, the way it's structured is we wanted to kind of start in at the very beginning of the first episode with 99, just to sort of remind people about that huge cultural moment, but then go back from there, by having, players who were on the 99 team, several of them were on the 91 team, and saying, look, a lot of people think women's soccer started in 1999, but there was so much that happened before that. And that is our way to kind of get into this origin story of how the U.S. women's national team got started, but also how the first FIFA Women's World Cup got organized. And so I love telling origin stories, especially ones that haven't really been told much before, because there's so much interesting stuff there.
Yeah.
And so the first episode gets into how the Women's World Cup by FIFA got started. And then the second episode is sort of the early days of the U.S. women's national team. Third episode gets into the 91 World Cup itself before the final. Fourth episode is mostly about the final in 91. And then the fifth episode gets into more about post-91, the sort of labor struggles between the U.S. women's players and U.S. soccer that has a through line to today, obviously, with the gender discrimination lawsuit filed a couple months ago by the U.S. women's players against U.S. soccer. And now, having done all these interviews and really having told this story, I have a much better idea about what happened in the past that has set up this current fight.
Well, yeah, I kind of want to go there because if you're talking gender discrimination in soccer, then you've got to be talking Sepp Blatter, who is in. I'm assuming that's kind of like archived interview from like past interviews you've done with him that is featured in the first episode, or did you actually get him in that first episode?
Oh no, we got Sepp Blatter.
Oh, wow.
Specifically for this.
Oh,
and it was I've never interviewed Sepp Blatter before one-on-one. Even when he was FIFA president for 17 years. And so I ended up having over an hour on the phone with Sepp Blatter from Zurich. And it was fascinating. He acted like a guy who had time on his hands, to be honest.
I mean, I guess he probably does. But that is so upsetting then, because I really assumed that was like from an interview you did like when you ran for FIFA president or something, because it's still so like out of date, which is amazing. Not that gender discrimination is ever acceptable, but like it does feel like it came from like another era where it was like, it was the 80s, he said stuff. But yeah, I actually wanted to talk about him a little bit more because it's really strange to me. And by the way, you are doing a very good job with your narrator voice and the kind of the narration flow. And especially so because I'm having a hard time really knowing how to feel about Sepp Blatter, and that's a strange feeling to be in because I was initially like, oh, of course he's going to claim credit for starting the first Women's World Cup, but then it seems like maybe he deserves a little bit of credit. So I'm wondering how much, like, I guess responsibility we should give him for creating the first Women's World Cup, or as I believe it was going to be known, the first FIFA World Championship for women's football for the M&M's Cup. I think I've got that written down properly.
That is correct.
Goodness gracious.
Sepp Blatter, in terms of women's soccer, is a pretty complex character. I mean, so much of how Blatter is viewed in the U.S. and in other countries too is, he's like he presided over this era of corruption, absolutely shady. Got his comeuppance when he resigned in 2015. And yet, in terms of how history should view Sepp Blatter in women's soccer, the more people I talk to, and that includes my friend Jean Williams, who's on the podcast. She's the leading historian out there on women's soccer. She's from Britain. And I said to her, and to Julie Foudy, I was like, Sepp Blatter, friend or foe of women's soccer? And I thought it was interesting that Jean Williams actually thought about it, kind of giggled for a second, but then thought about it seriously. And she's like, I'd say friend.
Wow.
Her take is that, yes, Sepp Blatter said some pretty cringe-inducing things over the years about women's soccer, which I asked him about, would you like to take back that quote from '04 about how women should be playing in tighter shorts? And he just said no. And I was like, okay.
He went the fake news route, is what it sounded like. He threw a little bit of well, that's not really what I said, even though that's definitely what I said.
Yeah, exactly. But all that said, in relative terms, compared to the Ice Age viewpoints of the men in FIFA and running national soccer federations at the time in the mid-'80s, that Sepp Blatter actually was slightly progressive in pure relative terms in pushing for the first Women's World Cup by FIFA to happen in 91. That said, I asked him about all this stuff in the podcast. The World Volleyball Championship for women, World Basketball Championship for women, those started in the 1950s. FIFA waited until 1991 to have their first Women's World Championship. And actually, Blatter had some introspection on that. He was like, if you want to, you can blame me. FIFA was asleep. So he does at least say a few things in this podcast that you're like, he's acknowledging that he could have done more and FIFA could have done more. But that's the other problem is Sepp Blatter's this huge disappointment for women's soccer in the sense that he was FIFA president for 17 years from 98 to 2015 and didn't do nearly enough to help grow the sport of women's soccer around the world and really invest in that and encourage national federations and require national federations to do so.
But there were some members of the soccer community who did. One who I didn't know anything about until that first episode is, I believe she's dubbed the Norwegian mother of women's soccer or the mother of Norwegian soccer. I really enjoyed that it sounded like she made João Havelange sound like a 6-year-old and blame it on his friend, like it was Sepp's fault. How much did you know about her going in? Forgive me, I don't even have her name written down, so I'm not doing a very good job of honoring her. But can you tell us a bit about the Norwegian mother of soccer?
Yeah, her name's Ellen Wille, and in 1986 at the FIFA conference or FIFA Congress in Mexico City, which was taking place around that World Cup, she became the first woman ever to address the FIFA Congress. And João Havelange was the FIFA president at the time. Blatter was his number 2 as general secretary. And Havelange was reading the annual report about what FIFA had done over the previous year. And to hear Ellen talk about it to us, she was really upset that there was only one paragraph devoted to women's soccer in that annual report. And so when Havelange asked for any comments from the gallery, from all the attendees at the FIFA Congress, Ellen Wille addresses the entire FIFA Congress, all men, and says, this is unacceptable. Your report here, what little of it there is about women's soccer. And she spends 10 minutes telling them that, look, you guys, FIFA, need to create a FIFA Women's World Cup. And also women's soccer needs to get into the Olympics. This sport needs support. And Havelange's response was, I didn't write the report. Sepp Blatter wrote the report. Apparently said in Portuguese or French or something. Yeah. And so Blatter is put on the spot, and everyone actually agrees on this story. Even Blatter and Ellen Wille all agree on what happened. So Blatter responds to Ellen Wille in front of the entire FIFA Congress, Madame, yes, we will do a FIFA Women's World Cup. And Blatter, to his credit, because if you obviously that's the right response. But in that particular setting, it wasn't necessarily going to be the response that Blatter or someone in his position might have given.
Yeah, I was really surprised when it sort of was like that sudden of a change.
Right. And so that was in 86. And so, it does take a while to organize a World Cup for the first time. And so Blatter and FIFA organized a dress rehearsal Women's World Cup in China in 1988 that the U.S. takes part in. And by the way, that U.S. team went out in the quarterfinals to Norway and wasn't very good in that tournament, sort of supporting the idea that they weren't great from the start. And then 3 years later in 91, they have the M&M's Cup. They didn't want to actually give it the term World Cup, Women's World Cup, because they were afraid it wouldn't be a success. It's just so FIFA.
It's very FIFA, yeah.
And so retroactively, later, once it was a success in terms of crowd support, they went back and FIFA called it the first Women's World Cup and decided to continue doing the Women's World Cup because that wasn't a sure thing.
I'm sure that when they make their follow-up to the movie they made about themselves, FIFA will portray themselves as like always knowing that it was going to succeed. But I'll stick with Throwback until then. So we're, 2 episodes in, third one out today?
So the third episode comes out on Thursday. I don't know. So they drop every Thursday through, I think it's June 6th.
Hey, everybody, much more still to come, but I wanted to take a break because, doing the interviewing can be a little bit, time-consuming. It can require some emotional, focus, and I want to back away and instead just be completely emotionally unfocused because I want to talk to Daryl Grove. Hi, Daryl.
Hey, I've never thought of you as emotionally unfocused.
More so just, I'm not behind the wheel as much when Daryl Grove is involved. I'll put it that way.
Oh, I see. Is that a polite way of saying I talk too much?
No, not at all. It's quite the opposite. It's more so that Daryl Grove does the driving and I can just pop in whenever I want to.
Ironically, that's the only time I do the driving. So that's good.
This is very true. But you're here with me to answer one listener question and also talk about some sponsors. Let's get to that then. Should we talk about some Grip 6 belts? Are you wearing one right now? You tend to be wearing one.
Of course I am.
Attaboy.
I did bring my shorts to England thinking it would be nice and warm.
How'd that work out?
I was wrong. I ended up wearing jeans. I ended up wearing a Grip 6 belt around my jeans.
I do. There's a weird, I wouldn't say I have pride in the state of Virginia. There are many, many reasons not to have pride in the state of Virginia, both past and present. But I will say that there are moments when you go back home and you come back and I just see you enjoy being in Richmond, mostly because it's not 12 degrees outside. That makes me very happy.
The food has flavors.
Also, the food has flavors.
And people say hello on the street. It's amazing.
There's no hellos on the street. I just assumed it was all very Mary Poppins, everybody doffing caps and whatnot.
Oh, I'm going around saying hello on the street and people look really scared. That's people don't expect it.
I see, and I'm familiar because I remember living in Northern Virginia and walking the dog. The dogs get smiles, the humans don't. There will be no smiles back and forth amongst humans, but I will smile at your dog. I will extend you that courtesy.
Should we get back to Grip 6 belts?
I suppose we should. So you brought the belt to wear with shorts, but now you're wearing it with pants? Is that
yes,
the gist
I
of
am, because it keep my pants up. And when I got home, my dad was wearing the Grip 6 belt that I got him with the Total Soccer Show logo on it.
Really? He was?
Yeah.
That makes me really happy.
Grove family Grip 6 belts night out we had.
Did he understand what it was and where it came from?
Yes, I mean at the time, yeah.
Okay.
Because I explained it to him, and people seem slightly when they see the way the Grip 6 belt works, the gripping mechanism. I think some people are slightly confused about it. My dad is confused about lots of things sometimes. Sometimes he picks up the remote control to answer the phone. But he figured out the Grip 6 belt really easily because it's kind of intuitive how it works once you're wearing it.
I mean, yeah, I think that's definitely one of the strongest features. And the other one is just kind of not having to deal with the holes and the adjustments and all that good stuff because there are no holes.
Flaps.
There's no flap hanging out. You slide it into the buckle. You go until it's secure. It holds that way all day because of badger teeth, as we've talked about before. But it's very strong, lightweight, aircraft grade aluminum is the buckle. So it doesn't kind of sit. You don't get that kind of blocky feeling sometimes when you're sitting down that you do with other belts. And it's nice and lightweight. I'm wearing mine right now with my shorts because it is about 90 degrees here in Richmond. The AC is on full throttle.
Yay!
Yeah. Yeah, and so the other great thing about Grip 6 is that it can be returned for a full refund plus shipping at any time under any condition for any reason. They're the only company that offers such a warranty for belts, and it's very much appreciated because if you're going to...
You know why they do it?
Why is that?
They do it because they know you won't want to send it back because it's too good. You don't want to give it up once you've got it. And because it's so well made, they know it's not going to break down.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that, but I also appreciate that, like, with any sort of new product or different product, and I would say the Grip 6 belt is a different type of product, that there is that hesitance of like, but like, is it going to work, or is it going to be one of those things where it looks really cool and then you kind of immediately become familiar with why it doesn't work as well, but now you're pot committed with the kind of guarantee that you can send it back. You can take that risk, and then if you don't like it, you'll like it. But if you don't, then you can send it back, but more likely if you like it, then you can keep it and go buy some more.
And if you don't like it, you're wrong.
Exactly.
You can also get the Total Soccer Show listener discount if you go to grip6.com/TSS. That's GRIP, the number 6.com. You've seen that before, /TSS. And there's a special landing page just for Total Soccer Show listeners with the discounts that you can get as a TSS listener. I guess you can share it with other people who don't listen to the show. That still works, but they'll be confused about all the Total Soccer Show stuff.
Yeah. Yes, that makes sense to me. So that code one more time was what, Daryl?
grip6.com/TSS is the URL to go to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much to Grip6 for sponsoring today's episode. Thank you very much to Jesse Frankel for sending in a question for us to answer. Jesse asks, over the last 25 years, going back to the 94 World Cup, what former USMNT-er would have made the largest impact for the national team program had they reached their realistic peak? That could be a career cut short by injuries like Stu Holden or Charlie Davies, or someone who just didn't quite pan out, say, for example, Freddy Adu.
Do you want me to answer first?
Sure.
I think it's actually, you'll have to permit me sort of two answers, but they're connected. It's a combination of John O'Brien and Stu Holden.
Okay.
Because I also think Stu Holden would have been the successor to John O'Brien because they're somewhat similar in that they were like number 8s who could go both ways, right? They could do a defensive job and they could also do a creative job, and they would get up and down the field, and they were sort of high quality players. John O'Brien, if everyone remembers from 2002, was the number 8 that sort of made everything tick in that midfield, right? He was the link between the defensive midfielder and, like, say, Claudio Reyna as the attacking midfielder. He was playing for Ajax at the time, which was incredible. And then essentially he just got a series of injuries and things broke down, and he really tried, right? He really tried to keep playing. Arena even brought him back for the 2006 World Cup, but it's really obvious that he just couldn't do it anymore. And soon after, he was retired. Mm-hmm. And then Stu Holden similarly has that sort of defensive presence, attacking presence, box to box. This is the player that I remember. He was just establishing himself in the Premier League in like 2011 when he had that horrible tackle from, I believe, Johnny Evans that took out Holden's knee. And Holden, he came back a couple of times, but essentially never recovered. Holden would have been Michael Bradley's midfield partner, and I think it really, really would have worked over that next decade or so. I think he's only actually looked this up. Holden's 33 right now. He would just be slowing down now, coming towards the end of his career. So all these problems we've had in the past, like with people complaining about Michael Bradley, or like the Bradley Jones partnership doesn't work, or Bradley needed a partner when we played against Trinidad, and instead of like having him sit there on his own in that whole Bruce Arena period, Stu Holden could have been that guy for years and years and years. So I think actually my answer is Stu Holden, but with the sort of backup of saying if we'd also had John O'Brien, then we would have had this weird like continuity of a really high quality number 8 for like 2 decades.
Here's the thing. Even though Daryl Grove and I are continents apart, we still somehow spend too much time together because I have 3 names written down. 2 of them are joined. They're John O'Brien and Stu Holden are the 2 that are joined.
And you've joined them up as well?
I have indeed. For the exact reasons that you have. Because because of everything you've said is accurate, the one thing I would add to it is just that, like...
I thought you were surprisingly quiet while I was giving my answer. That just meant you were just sitting there nodding.
I was just nodding. Yeah, if you go back and listen, there's one where I'm like, yep. It's because like I just want to emphasize that like they were 2 guys who were doing it. Like you go back to John O'Brien, like I remember because this was not 2002 era Taylor, there were probably people out there who were, but I didn't know that squad until it was announced, probably until their first game. I didn't really know who was going to be playing for the U.S. And suddenly here's this guy, John O'Brien, who then I read more about, and I'm like, wait, what? He's playing for Ajax? Like, that's amazing. I know who Ajax are. They're incredible. How's he doing that? And like, it's suddenly this American who's doing this thing at this big name club. And I would extend that to Stu Bolton. Like, I remember he was their player of the year. He was this player who was kind of running that midfield at a time where Bolton didn't have the financial difficulties, or not to the extent they do now. Bolton were Bolton, and it was really exciting that there was this American coming through who felt like he was going to be the engine for that team.
Yep.
And that's
they
what
finished
both of them
seventh
felt
in the Premier League that season.
Exactly.
Seventh in the Premier League.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think for me,
they were the Wolves of 2011.
I don't know why I find that so funny, but I do. Yeah, and so I think for everything you've said, but just plus that little factor of like, these are two guys who it felt like, wow, there are some Americans who can be that kind of standard bearer. It is what kind of like what Christian Pulisic and Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams are now, of like players who are doing it abroad, who can show young Americans like, yeah, this is possible, and you can play for a big club and have success. They were doing it back in 2002 and 2006, and I think if they kind of reached that full peak and avoided some of the injuries, they move to an even higher level than I think where we saw them, where we remember them.
I also want to address Charlie Davies, who
Sure.
Jesse mentions. I think there's a strong argument that Charlie Davies would have had a huge impact at the 2010 World Cup.
I agree.
Because Bob Bradley had built that team, right? The 2009 team. Like people call it like bunker Bob and all that, is like I think is really the wrong way of thinking about it. It was an excellent counter-attacking team where he did have Bradley and a defensive midfielder alongside him, and then Donovan and Dempsey on the wings ready for a counter-attack, and Josie and a really fast Charlie Davies next to him. And it was deadly on the counterattack. We nearly won the Confederations Cup, right? We beat Spain. We were a goal up on Brazil. And it was based on Davies having that counterattacking speed. And then obviously there was the car crash. We all know that story. It would have been great to take Altidore and that version of Charlie Davies to the 2010 World Cup. And instead we took essentially, was it Robbie Findlay as a sort of next best thing to Davies, like essentially get a fast striker, and it just wasn't quite the same. I feel like maybe long term wasn't a recipe for massive success, because I'm not really sure what Charlie Davies' ceiling was. But I feel at least the pace and the familiarity in the relationship between Altidore and Davies would have been effective for at least a couple of years, but maybe not in the sort of decade-long way that I would see Stu Holden having an impact.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then I feel like that's kind of like a what if, and I sort of have a what if as well, because it's a player who did go on to have a successful career with the national team. You know his name, but I do think that one injury does sort of change it a little bit. It's Jermaine Jones, because we forget first became eligible to play for the U.S. national team in October of 2009. Could easily have been on that World Cup, that 2010 World Cup squad, but the prolonged injury keeps him out. He doesn't end up going. And if you remember back, remember how we kept conceding early, and there was the Ricardo Clark, Maurice Adu conundrum of who do we play in the midfield and why isn't it working? And even some of the soccer that we played in 2010 was not particularly compelling. And I do wonder if you have Jermaine Jones there, do you have that sort of dynamism that we've come to expect from him at that level, at that time? Is he driving that midfield? Does he kind of knock everything together? Is it a stronger World Cup result as a result? And I also then look at his club career.
Jermaine Jones?
And this is when, because of that injury, this is when you see him kind of leave Schalke. He goes on loan to Blackburn. It doesn't quite work. He goes on loan to Besiktas. It doesn't quite work. He ends up moving back to MLS a couple of years later. And I do wonder if he doesn't have this injury and this downturn in form at that time, does he kind of stay with Schalke, or does he get another move because it felt like maybe Germany was done for him, but he moves to a place that fits a little bit better? He kind of continues to play at a higher level. I don't think he has any regrets necessarily about where his career has gone. But I think it's strange to look back and only have Jermaine Jones playing one World Cup for the national team because of what happened in 2018. So the idea of getting him in there in 2010, I do think it changes his narrative just a little bit.
Wasn't he still in Europe in 2014, though? I don't remember him being an MLS player, because I remember him joining MLS after sort of his fame at the 2014 World Cup, because that maximised his MLS market value. So he still had a couple years at Schalke after that, right?
Yeah, I think he leaves Schalke in 2014. I think that's when 2014 is when he's at Besiktas. He had definitely not come back yet, because that was when we were having our conversations about Bradley coming back. I think was before that World Cup.
Got it. Okay. God, I nearly did another Jack Grealish mistake. Why didn't either of us go with Jesse's sort of other suggestion of someone who didn't pan out, with maybe Freddy Adu being the example of a youth player we talked up or was talked up and then didn't pan out.
All right, I think I'm going to go like full Chuck Klosterman here, and I'm going to say, because I think we needed a player like Freddy Adu. Like, we needed, like, that's a name that even if you're just sort of getting into soccer, you probably, but if you're like of a certain age, you probably know Freddy Adu. My wife knows who Freddy Adu is.
Yeah,
She'll
yeah.
ask me why
a bunch of people over here know Freddy Adu.
Exactly. Now. And I think we know that because he was the next big thing. He's the new Pele. He's in Sierra Mist commercials with Pele. That's weird. And now to know where it's gone, like it is a sort of cautionary tale that you kind of need, to then when Timothy Weah comes through or when Julian Green comes through or any other young, exciting player, like you can sort of look at it as like, yeah, but let's hold off and see. I honestly I thought about Freddy Adu when we talked about Tyler Boyd of like, is this a player who now that he can play for the national team, we're just all super hyped about him because he plays in Europe and he scores goals. And well, actually, I guess kind of plays in Asia if you want to go that route because Ankara Gaju, nerd. But you need a player like Freddy Adu, I think, to kind of remind you like, hey, don't get blown away by things just because he's young and exciting. See what he can actually offer. So I guess that's part of my answer. Forgive me for going long, because the other aspect of it is just that, like, but I also think that we kind of knew what Freddy Adu's ceiling was. I think we know it now. I feel like he kind of,
yeah.
It's just that going back and watching and kind of knowing what we know now and knowing what we've heard in the years since about how he's kind of a flair player who didn't necessarily want to learn the tactics, didn't necessarily want to improve that part of his game. Like, I think it's kind of inevitable. And so I guess for me, he's not a player who kind of didn't pan out. It's just a player that in the end didn't go where we thought it would.
Yeah,
and there is a distinction there. I'm not sure why I think there's a distinction, but there is in my mind.
Well, I think because when there's an injury, there's a thing you can point to that was like, okay, his career took a bad turn at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Freddy Adu, I think essentially it's not his fault, right? Like maybe he was always going to be the player with the career he's had, right? Which is kind of nomadic because he's got flashes of skill, but maybe doesn't fit in tactically places, right? And he has a wonderful left foot, but yeah, again, doesn't fit in tactically. So he's not a player that people value long term because eventually a coach is not going to be happy with a player like that. And the only sort of crime here is not Freddy Adu's crime of being hyped. It's the fact that essentially MLS needed a face. So MLS hyped this 14-year-old kid. Yeah. So 13, 14 when they started talking about him. I mean, in hindsight, it's almost abusive to like put that much attention on a kid when you don't really know what type of player he's going to be and you're hyping him as like literally the American Pele. It's really unfair to him. Yeah. It's absolutely unfair. So yeah, Freddy Adu I think was always going to be Freddy Adu, and it's our expectations were too high, not Freddy Adu's expectations.
That's what I was trying to get at. You said it much better than I ever could. So thank you for that, Daryl Grove. Hopefully you can do the same thing, unless you have more players who didn't work out to talk about.
No, not really, because I think any youth player that you talk about that, quote, didn't work out, it's like, that's how they were going to be, right? So it's like the Adu situation, but to a less extreme extent. When you talk someone up when they're young and then you imagine that they're going to win the Ballon d'Or, then it's you that's made a mistake, right? It's not that the player got injured or something.
I think that's totally fair. So in the end, are we going to say, I think I'll go Stu Holden and then John O'Brien and then Jermaine Jones as my list of three.
All right, I'll go Holden with like a parentheses of and also John O'Brien.
Yeah.
With Charlie Davies short term for Charlie Davies for the 2010 World Cup.
All right. I can get behind that. But if a player does reach his or her full potential, they do become a global superstar, maybe today's sponsor will let you know that, because maybe you can get a scarf of that player or their name on it by going to roughneckscarves.com. They have many scarves because they are the official scarf providers of U.S. Soccer, of Major League Soccer, of the USL, and of the NCAA.
And they have, I know you mentioned it on last week's ad, Taylor, but I think it's really worth letting people know about the US Women's National Team collection. Endless US Women's National Team scarves with some big name players with their name in big letters on a scarf, on a normal size scarf.
I'm going to take a controversial approach to this by saying one name that's not there, that, hey, Roughneck Scarves, get that name there. Rose Lavelle. I need a Rose Lavelle scarf. I need that in my life because I am fully on board the Rose Lavelle hype train. I think I've been on it for like a couple years now. So I need a Rose Lavelle scarf to go that off.
Talk you into it as well? I enjoyed the Caitlin Murray interview. I think she made the really good point about our creativity through the middle is Rose Lavelle. That's why she's super important.
I mean, yes, that certainly did not hurt my estimations of Rose Lavelle. Caitlin, as usual, did do a good job of kind of helping helping me calm down a little bit. I appreciate that she shared my concerns about some of the issues and some of the decisions Jill Ellis has made. But yes, overall, she made me feel better, and definitely made me feel better about all of the hype I have thrown Rose Lavelle's way.
Did you feel weirdly validated when Caitlin said, I listened to your show? First of all, I was like, oh, Caitlin listened to our show.
I know. Yes, that's why I felt strangely validated.
Yeah, and she mostly agreed with stuff. Yeah. I also heard the part where you tried to blame me for your bad opinions.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I don't think that happened.
I've got my ear on you.
I forgot that I literally did that. Yeah. Anyway, so hopefully Roughneck Scarves gets the Rose Lavelle scarf. But if they don't have time, as you said, you can get many different scarves to represent the U.S. women's team, both individual players and the team as a whole. Yeah,
and you can use them, like, if you get the Julia Ertz scarf, you can, like, tackle people with it. Like,
of course.
Just wrap it around their legs. If you get the Tobin Heath scarf, you can sort of use it to dribble through crowds. There's all kinds of good uses for these scarves.
Yes, it throws itself between your opponent's legs. That's what the Tobin Heath scarf does.
Yeah, you can just, like, pull it through. And
exactly.
Shout, Scarf Meg.
Yep. But as I said, you can also represent MLS teams, USL sides, your colleges as we get ready. I feel like people are permanently getting ready for the start of college football season, regardless of whether or not it's in season or like months away. But if you have, maybe you've decided which university you're going to attend, you're a graduating senior in high school, then maybe you want to get a Roughneck scarf to celebrate that decision.
And if you want 20% off when you go to roughneckscarves.com, use the discount code Total Soccer Show. All one word, Total Soccer Show gets you 20% off at roughneckscarves.com.
Thank you very much to Roughneck Scarves for sponsoring today's episode. Thank you very much to Daryl Grove for taking the intellectual wheel that, I could just zone out for a while.
Have your emotions had a rest?
Yeah, they have. Now I can get back to the interview. But Daryl Grove, thank you very much. We look forward to having you back in studio if and when you return from your far-off mystical land of England.
I'll be back.
There we are. All right, so definitely check that out. I've enjoyed it. It's been way better than the FIFA movie, but that's not a very high bar. I did also want to talk to you about the book Masters of Modern Soccer. I think the paperback just came out, or just became available in paperback, because you have a chapter focused on Vincent Kompany. He has, obviously, in recent news, departed Manchester City to be player coach at Anderlecht. I'm assuming he's going to end up doing more coaching than playing, but I'm wondering, from your time with him, what are your expectations for him as a manager?
You never know for sure, right? But I mean, I would have to think that Vincent Kompany has the ingredients to be a successful manager. Just having the honor, to be honest, to like spend a lot of time with him talking soccer, talking the game itself for my book was just really, really amazing. He's a thoughtful guy, a smart guy, but part of that is also him allowing that his thoughts on the game of soccer have changed over the years. And he's like, look, if I had the same viewpoints on the sport and the finer points of it that I had when I was 20 years old as I do now in my 30s, that would be a problem. But actually, there's a lot of people out there, including ex-players, who have had the same thoughts about the sport for that long. To talk to Kompany about how much he learned in his 30s under Pep Guardiola, and get into specifics with him for the book was just really interesting. A lot of it about very fine points of positional play. And just how Guardiola had caused him to look at the game, and Kompany, who has a sense of humor, saying, I was injured a lot too, so that gave me more time to look at it from that perspective. I think Kompany could be a good manager. I'm also excited to have a player manager again. How many of those have we seen since Ruud Gullit and Walter Zenga with the New England Revolution?
There have not been many. That's for sure. And we had Drogba, the owner player. I think that was a rare one as well.
But I am pretty excited about what Vincent Kompany could do, and I'm not that surprised, I guess. I was slightly surprised that he didn't do a one-year extension with City, especially considering the way he finished the season. But that's pretty smart of him as well to go out on that note, scoring such an important goal. And I think people are going to, connected to City, are going to view Kompany more now for his finish than for the injuries over the last few years.
Speaking of that goal, I wanted to highlight that moment because he does have a lot of moments where he's talking about defending and the art of defending and how it's always been kind of the thing that motivates him. But he also talks about when he goes forward, and basically at City have so many attacking options. But there are moments when he does decide he's going to get involved, and he basically says it's all about belief that if he goes forward, he backs himself to score, that if I'm going forward, then I'm going to score a goal. And I thought about that when he scored that goal for Leicester, because it really was just all right, I'm going to go do this. And I did wonder, did you remember that in that moment, that he has that quote in your book that basically perfectly explains what's happening in that moment? And were you celebrating, haha, I knew?
I might have even done a victory tweet with a screenshot from that quote. The thing about it, though, is even when we were talking about that, when he would go upfield, most of the time it would be in the context of a set piece. But he did talk about going on sort of 60-yard runs with the ball upfield, which he and I had talked about when we watched a lot of video together and would see him do that from time to time. And he actually uses the term going Anderlecht, which is where he started out and where they taught him to be a ball-playing defender who had skills at the attacking end. And so even for Kompany, there have been some moments over the years, if you remember at the crazy end in the final game of the 2012 season when they, Aguero's goal, Kompany's in the box. Yep. He's up front. So he did do that from time to time, but I think even for Kompany, it was unusual. I think that was the first time, at least in the Premier League, that he had ever scored a goal from outside the box.
There you go. And he claims, I think, in the one you're talking about from 2012, doesn't he claim that his dummy or his nutmeg was the thing that started it all?
He had a half smile, but I think he was half serious.
All right. That checks out. And also, I'm a Manchester United fan. So, yes, I remember that game vividly. Thanks for that. You also said in that chapter that you looked forward to speaking to Vincent Kompany and to Xabi Alonso, which in my mind indicates that there were maybe some interviewees that you did not look forward to.
Oh, no, don't take it that way.
All right.
No, I just, for me, to have this much time for this book over a couple years period, over multiple interviews where we were just talking about the specifics of the sport itself. We weren't talking about, I wasn't talking with Chicharito about his girlfriend or anything like that. And it just was... As I was doing all those interviews, it reminded me how silly it is, how rarely we actually talk to players about what they're experts in, which is the game itself, and really digging in. And part of that's because we don't always get enough access and time to do that. But to watch video of the players themselves and be talking to them about what was going on in their heads, why were you, what were you doing here, what were you considering, and even Christian Pulisic. And we did most of the interviews for it in 2017. So he was still very much a teenager, but he was engaged and really thoughtful about the sport itself. And you really came away with a sense that, if someday, a long time from now, if Christian Pulisic wants to, work in TV and talk about the sport, he's got the ability to break it down like that in an interesting way. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Kompany's done TV work, that other people in this book could do TV work, whether it's Roberto Martinez has, obviously. But I did learn a lot about the craft of the sport, position by position, from the guys I spoke to.
Pretty good way to learn. I also kind of forgot that you talked to Christian Pulisic in that book because I guess I'm wondering, because you speak to him, and I wanted to ask you about exploring Planet Futbol as well. Mm-hmm. But you speak to him in that new series. How different is he from when you first met him, when you first interviewed him, or has he been pretty kind of consistent all the way through?
What I would say about Pulisic is that, like a lot of athletes, he can turn it on and turn it off in interviews. And like a lot of athletes, he tends to go onto autopilot when it's a group interview, like in a post game situation, and then it becomes Not always the most interesting discussion.
Yeah, we just wanted to, make sure we were the better team today and score some goals. And at the end of the day, a win's a win, and 3 points is all that matters. Yeah, you get those type of very straightforward answers. Yeah,
and the longer he's been a pro, I think the more that maybe he's gotten into that from a group interview setting. But in terms of one-on-one interviews, I've had the fortune of really enjoying a lot of those with Christian over the years. And, the interviews that we did for the book project were very soccer specific, like what is happening specifically on the field. And he was great at that. For Exploring Planet Futbol, which is our video series on SITV, we just had a new episode come out on U.S. men's national team players in Germany. We did a road trip around the country, and we sat down with Pulisic, McKennie, Tyler Adams, Chris Richards, Jesse Marsh. It was really fun. And those interviews, we wanted to get the players, including Christian, sort of away from their club setting. And so we went to the restaurant in Dortmund where he actually signed his first contract.
Oh, wow.
And celebrated that as a 15-year-old. And it seemed like a little bit like we were coming full circle in a sense because, when we recorded it, a few weeks ago, we already knew that he was going to be going to Chelsea, that he was winding down his time in Germany. And so he was in a reflective mood about looking back on his experience in Germany and the details of what that was like coming over and how hard it was. So it was less a discussion of what was happening on the field than it was about his life over there in this chapter of his life that was closing. And, you could tell that it's a really meaningful thing to him. His experience in Germany totally changed his life. And so I've been doing this for 23 years now at Sports Illustrated. So it's interesting over the years to see how the people you cover change. And if you cover someone, do interviews with them when they were 17, they're not going to be the same at 20. They're not going to be the same at 28 or 35. And so I think the same will be the case with Pulisic.
Is that strange for you as the interviewer, or for you who you've been doing this as long as you have? Like, is it almost like he didn't used to answer my questions like that? Like, do you take it that personally, or are you just sort of like, all right, well, he's in a different mindset right now?
I mean, like, to Christian's credit, whenever we've done a one-on-one interview, I think he's been engaged. Mm-hmm. And as he's gotten older, I think he's gotten more relaxed, and that's just natural. And I don't take it personally if we're doing a group interview or something and he's not saying a heck of a lot, because like I said, that's 99% of athletes. But I would say that, like, my experience on this trip through Germany in this half-hour show is not only should U.S. fans be excited about these 20-year-olds, Pulisic, Tyler Adams, Weston, McKennie in particular, because they're just really good players and very promising to potentially become real stars. But they're also really good interviews. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they're thoughtful, smart guys. And maybe that's something that you and me in the media appreciate more than other people. But I think everyone has, to some extent, wants to get to know these guys as human beings and get a sense of what they think about the world. And it is kind of, I think it's easier to root for somebody if you're a fan, if you're like, I think that guy's really thoughtful. I think Tyler Adams is, has a lot of interesting things to say and is, probably going to be a future captain of the national team.
Yeah, I got that from him. I got that from McKennie as well. I was actually going to ask you which of them you think is more likely to be a captain, but instead I wanted to ask you actually about your approach to it, because I definitely, I found myself with doing more interviews, watching more people do interviews, because there are things that I like about the way I ask questions or the questions I ask, and things I don't love as much. You seem to have found a way, especially in the McKennie interview, the one that stood out to me there, was that you ask tough questions and you kind of leave it to them to answer them however they want to. And so like the one that stood out to me was like, I think at least in the video, the first question you ask him is about like, why do you think there are more Americans, like why has the Bundesliga supplanted the Premier League in terms of where young Americans want to be? And I was sort of like, wow, that's a question I would like do a bunch of research on and really think about. And he pauses for like a couple seconds and kind of scratches his head and then basically gives a perfect answer. And I was just sort of like blown away how like, I guess I think because they're 20, because they're young, I would feel this inclination to sort of like give them a crutch. Like, do you think it's because of this? Do you think it's because of this? And sort of like help them out. And I really appreciated how you just kind of floated the question and sat back and like, do with it what you will. And he gave an amazing answer.
We threw McKennie in the deep end.
Yeah, definitely.
And he did great. You know, I mean, obviously if, given a not very useful answer, we probably wouldn't have included it.
The beauty of editing,
but yeah, I like it's an interesting process. Interviews and like you're never going to get an interview 100% right, but I try to approach them by I would prefer not to give them potential answers and treat them as a full-fledged adult. And see where it takes you. And, McKennie's a guy who also is clearly very comfortable in his own skin. And we had spent a fair amount of time already that day. And it wasn't our first interview. But just a guy who's, who thinks about stuff. What stood out to me also, though, is he's not a soccer obsessive in the way that Tyler Adams is. Because when we spent an afternoon with Tyler Adams and Jesse Marsh, and they were checking that day's, it was a Saturday, and I think Leipzig had a rare Monday night game. So they were checking Bundesliga scores the entire time.
I mean, that's probably what it takes.
And, well, there are other ways. I mean, basically, Weston McKennie plays a lot of Fortnite. And I don't think he's checking too many scores on game day. And it works okay for him. You know, I will admit, like over the years, that I would get frustrated at times, even seeing young U.S. players on Twitter, if there was like a big game going on, like posting a picture of themselves like at the beach or something. But, not all of these guys are soccer obsessives, and McKennie makes it work for him. Now, Pulisic's another guy who watches a lot of soccer. So there's different ways, I guess, of going about things.
Pulisic watches a lot of soccer, is not, I guess, the master of ordering. I did want to ask, does he ever get the food he ordered, or did that not work out?
That's right. He orders a very specific sort of off-menu item that one of his teammates at Dortmund had suggested. And the waiter at first was a little like, I don't know what this is. And so, yes, Christian did eat lunch that day. I'm sorry we didn't have the answer in the video.
I made sure to watch like all the way through just in case, because like I really want to know if he actually pulled it off. He was able to order if the kitchen knew what he was asking for. So I'm glad that worked out for him. But I also, moving away from what they ate and what they drank, the Tyler Adams bit that I thought was really good. Again, I don't want to give away like too much of it because I would encourage people to go watch. But I liked the point about like kind of his enthusiasm, and I feel like y'all got a few good shots of that from him in training. And it seems like, because I've wondered what it was that maybe made him gel with that squad so quickly. You ask him about kind of, does having Jesse Marsh there help? And I'm assuming it does. But it did feel to me like the kind of enthusiasm and energy he appears to have brought to training. Like you could just see him like motivating everybody. He's turning stuff into like competitions, and they're all kind of getting into it. And to me, it felt like that's kind of what he brings to the table. That's what makes him so good. Is that a thing that you saw as well?
Yeah, and that's something that Jesse Marsh was saying, was that like Tyler's arrival in January was a really pleasant, positive energy injection into that team. Not that it was struggling, because Leipzig had a good season, but it helped that Adams came in ready to play, fit, and showed in training from the very start that he was not going to need some adjustment period. And that's why he was able to get a spot in the starting lineup so quickly. And Marsh was like, none of the players objected. It was just like, yeah, this kid can play, and he's good for us. It was interesting also, too, just going to a training session at Leipzig, and this was in February, so you're quite a ways into the season. in comparing that Leipzig training session mood to the one at Schalke, and Schalke was about to fire their coach. They were near the bottom of the Bundesliga, and their training session was open to the public, and a lot of those folks looked pissed off. Like, they were like not like happy about things at all at that training session. And the training session, when you watched it, McKennie was actually injured that day, so he was trained to the side. But the players at the Schalke training session it was like night and day compared to the enthusiasm among the players at the Leipzig training session.
And for you, who's like filming, documenting all this, when you get there, you're like, oh, this is not good. This is not the vibe we're going for.
It was real, though. I mean, like, we shot a little bit inside McKennie's car, and I don't think this ended up making the final version of our video. We had some amazing like stuff on the cutting room floor, but like he talked about the adjustment process as a young player to having that type of a season and how you deal with that being not fun, but something that you're going to go through at some point in your career, most likely. And how do you go about that and accept it and respond to it? Like that's a real thing. And the other weird thing was, at the time, Schalke was still alive in Champions League against Man City and had actually almost beaten Man City in the round of 16 opening leg. And yet they were just imploding in the league. They ended up avoiding relegation, but they finished second in the Bundesliga the previous season, and here they are, being relegation threatened.
Yeah, so they're maybe not having the trajectory they would have liked. I did enjoy, in terms of the structure of the episode, that your trajectory was you went from trying to navigate the streets of Germany yourself via your phone to letting Weston McKennie do the driving. Is that about how it went?
So one fun thing about this stuff is when we say we were trying to get the players away from the club environment, that's typically, even if you do a one-on-one interview, that's typically what happens. You're on a chair with, two chairs interviewing these guys at the training site. And one thing we found is if you interview a player while he's driving in his car, it's just more relaxed, and they're more willing to, I think, give you a better interview. And they're also a little distracted.
Yep.
I don't know if it's legal to be interviewing somebody with a camera while they're actually driving, but I'm
sure it's fine. Whatever.
And it was just interesting to make some comparisons. So McKennie's driving this hot AMG Mercedes, like pretty fantastic car. And, he's been there a little longer. And Tyler Adams had just gotten there a month earlier and was driving one of these like club issued Volkswagens. I think he was looking forward to maybe having some better wheels as time went on. And
he was he was so sweet at the part where he's like waiting outside the restaurant deciding what he wants to order so he can say it properly. Like I love that he's like this playing in front of 50,000 people every weekend or whatever, but then nervous to make a coffee order. That's a great insight into Tyler Adams, I think.
It was pretty great. Like, he was like, the secret is not just knowing what to say when you make the order, but what to say when they respond to you. And like, he thinks deeply about this.
Damn. Well, it's a great episode. Again, how can people find Exploring Planet Futbol?
So it's on SITV. That's the streaming channel that we have. We have a 7-day free trial. It's cheap. Otherwise, I think it's like $5 a month. If you go beyond that, it's si.tv. And we have this series. It's, we go around the world doing half-hour episodes on, they're half travel show, half soccer show, and they're about the culture of soccer in particular countries. So the two that are up there now are Iceland and Germany with these U.S. national team guys. We have another one on Japan that comes out in a couple of weeks, and then another one on Argentina that comes out a few weeks after that. And we're going to do more. It's been a lot of fun.
So it sounds like you've got like as hectic of a schedule as possible this summer, because I'm assuming you're still also doing some reporting.
Oh, yeah. So I'll be in France for the entirety of Women's World Cup for Sports Illustrated and for Fox Sports doing TV. And I mean, honestly, my work on the video stuff is basically done. So that's my next big thing. I leave for France on June 2nd. And, we'll see what happens over there. Looking forward to it.
There we go. Maybe that's your podcast sequel right there. But again, that podcast is Throwback. That's available, I guess, wherever you get your podcasts. But Grant, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about everything you've got going on, all the many projects.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.